Okay, I'll start. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this Sunday's Rising Tide Foundation lecture. And today we have a very special treat because today's presentation will be by my wonderful wife, Magdalena. And some of you may remember her last lecture on the Boer War, which was, I call it a classic. It really exposed a lot of the history around it. Now, today's lecture is going to be called From the Monroe Doctrine to American Imperialism. And I just want to give people a little story on how she came to do this lecture, because through Matt and Cynthia, I came to know a gentleman named Jeff Brown and a friend of his, James Bradley. And I like to go to these, used bookstores and thrift stores and roam around for books. And I found a book by James Bradley. It was called The Imperial Cruise. And I read this book and I said, oh, there's a picture of it. Hold it up. And I said, I've never read a book which so exposes the fraud of Teddy Roosevelt. So I was talking about it to Magdalena, and I made her read it too. And so she read this book, James Bradley's book, and then she really got excited about it and started digging more and more and more into it. And so this is the result of beginning with James Bradley, but also a lot of the independent work she's done. Now, I just want to say this is going to be the first part of her lecture series. There's a second part that'll be coming in a couple weeks. And the second part is going to be on how all of this affected Hawaii and Cuba and the Philippines. But this first part is going to be a look into how did the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, a so-called anti-colonial doctrine, get perverted into the Corollary of Theodore Roosevelt, which became a colonialist policy. Or what were the influences that turned a nation that was committed to nation building into an imperial power? And she'll also go into this whole myth of the Teutons, the Teutons, and Anglo-Saxonism. Okay, so
Don't give it all away.
Yeah, okay. No more hints. So, Madeline, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you so very much. Okay, I appreciate that. Lovely introduction. I will share my screen right now. And I am trying to get, from the beginning. Oh, this black bar here on top is driving me nuts. Okay, here, slideshow. Okay, from the beginning. All right. Okay, so is everybody able to see this? I hope so. Okay. So, okay, Jerry rightly said this is the first part of two parts. The first part here is a little bit of a setup for the second part. I will not show everything that has to do with Teddy Roosevelt. This part is leading up to him becoming the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And then the second part will go further. So, okay. How from the Monroe Doctrine to Teddy's Corollary on how a nation committed to republicanism, not the Republican Party, people, how a nation committed to republicanism became an imperialistic power. So, and correctly, here is the book that I got a lot of ideas from. The Imperial Cruise by James Bradley. James Bradley also wrote a book called The Flyboys. Maybe some people read that. He's a very good writer. So how did the United States get from this here on the left, their territories held on the left in 1830, to what you see here on the right in 1905? You can see there is Alaska, there is different islands and so forth, all incorporated into the United States. So we're going to start with John Quincy Adams. He is actually the author of the Monroe Doctrine. It was named the Monroe Doctrine because James Monroe was president at the time. John Quincy Adams wrote in his diary, "It affords a very suitable and convenient opportunity for us to take our stand against the Holy Alliance, and at the same time to decline the overture of Great Britain. It would be more candid as well as more dignified to avow our principles explicitly to Russia and France than to come in as a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war." So he wrote this diary entry in November of 1823. What happened is that, and he talks about the opportunity, the opportunity to do this, because what just happened is the United States had recognized the independence of Colombia and Peru, Chile, Buenos Aires, and Mexico, but Great Britain had recognized none of these nations, or the independence of these nations. And Great Britain was just happy that the empires of Spain and France had been curtailed in the New World. And they had not reconciled themselves to the end of colonialism. So in 1823, Prime Minister George Canning made an offer to the United States, which he thought they couldn't refuse. Canning proposed a joint US-British declaration to guarantee the emancipation of Spain's colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And this is why John Quincy Adams made this notation in his diary saying, wonderful opportunity now to take our stand. And the stand, was, the Monroe Doctrine. It was presented to Congress on December 2nd, 1823 by James Monroe in his annual message to Congress. And Monroe declared that the United States would not tolerate any further colonization or involvement in the Western Hemisphere by European powers. The United States pledged itself as the unique and sole defender of the Republican independence of the nation-states of the Western Hemisphere against the oligarchical adventures and intrigues of the European nations of the Holy Alliance. The Holy Alliance being the empires in Europe. So this is, I'm just going to read, this is some of the Monroe Doctrine excerpts, and I'm just going to read the highlighted blue one. The political system of the Allied powers is essentially different in this respect from that of America. This difference proceeds from that which exists in their respective governments, and to the defense of our own, which has been achieved by the loss of so much blood and treasure, and matured by the wisdom of their most enlightened citizens, and under which we have enjoyed unexampled felicity. This whole nation is devoted. We owe it, therefore, to candor and the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. Very succinct. So the doctrine had four major principles. The United States would not interfere in the internal affairs of or the wars between European powers. The United States recognized and would not interfere with existing colonies and dependencies in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere was closed to future colonization, and any attempt by a European power to oppress or control any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as a hostile act against the United States. Within a few years of Monroe's proclamation, it had become a guideline for US foreign policy. In 1825, President John Quincy Adams' Secretary of State, Henry Clay, sent a set of instructions to Joel Poinsett, the US minister in Mexico, directing Poinsett to bring the Mexicans' attention to Monroe's message, asserting certain important principles of intercontinental laws in the relations of Europe and America. The first principle was that the Americas would no longer be considered subjects for colonization by European powers. The second principle, wrote Clay, is that we should regard as dangerous to our peace and safety any effort on the part of Europe to extend the political system to any portion of this hemisphere. The political systems of the two continents are essentially different. There are many monarchies in Europe at the time. Well, there still are. So the Monroe Doctrine was invoked and altered over time to justify US intervention in Latin America and the Caribbean, including the Roosevelt Corollary. So the original Monroe Doctrine is not at all the way it's being used today. So these are some of the years when the US invoked the Monroe Doctrine, okay? As you can see here. Getting Texas, California, Oregon, Haiti. So you have a lot of invocation of the Monroe Doctrine, but as I said, it changed over the years. So, okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about how the United States expanded westward. I put a quote here from Horace Greeley. He said, but just a little later, 1865, he said, Washington, D.C. is not a place to live in. The rents are high, the food is bad, the dust is disgusting, and the morals are deplorable. Sounds familiar? Go west, young man, go west and grow up with the country. So, in 1844, James Polk is elected. The United States was a small country at that point with states exclusively east of the Mississippi. The Louisiana Purchase was unorganized. Great Britain claimed the Oregon Territory in the Northwest. Mexico held what would later be Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California. At the end of his inauguration day, Polk told his Secretary of the Navy, George Bancroft, that one of his main goals was to acquire California. The US Navy had surveyed the Pacific coast in the early 1840s and reported that San Francisco was one of the finest, if not the best, harbor in the world, which of course is important if you want to go even further west. He said this extraordinary harbor is on direct route of traffic between India, China, and Manila, and the Pacific ports of Mexico and Central and South America. So this is 1844. And you can see Polk's domain here in blue. Clay, Henry Clay, less so. And you see the territories and areas that have not been expanded yet. So this is a very, very famous painting called American Progress by John Gast, which was painted in 1872. And it says civilization follows westwards on the American continent, bringing order and prosperity as stark savages recede. This painting became the most popular 19th century depiction of America's westward expansion. It's painted at the height of America's longest conflict, the Indian Wars. And American progress does not depict the thousands of US Army soldiers who ethnically cleansed the land of non-white others. But there's none here, as you can see. But in reality, this is really how the West was really won. This is a much later picture from 1890, burial of the dead at wounded Knee. And the quotation marks, white, end of quotation marks, victors called the Wounded Knee a battle, and the Indian losers called it a massacre. So this is mass burial of dead Indians. Theodore Roosevelt said in 1889, the vast movements by which this continent was conquered and peopled cannot be rightly understood if considered solely by itself. It was the crowning and greatest achievement of a series of mighty movements, and it must be taken in connection with them. Its true significance will be lost unless we grasp, however roughly, the past race history of the nations who took part therein. Now, I'm putting a disclaimer here. The following slides do not in any way portray the views of the speaker. They might and hopefully will offend many, if not all viewers present for this presentation. However, the following portrayed view was a widespread belief among the ruling population of the United States and Great Britain in the 19th and 20th century, and unfortunately endures to this day among certain elite. So what's this powerful, these powerful movements? So Roosevelt believed, and not just he, many other of the so-called ruling elite, believed that the powerful myth that proclaimed the white Christian male as the highest rung on the evolutionary ladder. It was the myth that civilization follows the sun. And this is the story. And I'm going to emphasize, this is a story. Once upon a time, the story went, an Aryan race sprang up in the Caucasus Mountains north of what is now Iran. The word Iran derives from the word Aryan. The Aryan was a beautiful human specimen, white-skinned, big-boned, sturdily built, blue-eyed, and unusually intelligent. He was a doer, a creator, a wanderer, a superior man with superior instincts, and above all, a natural civilizer. In time, the Aryan migrated north, south, east, and west. The ancient glories of China, India, and Egypt, and indeed all the world's great civilizations were the product of his genius. But a fatal error occurred over time. The pure white Aryan mixed his blood with non-white Chinese, Indian, and Egyptian females, and the result was dirt and deterioration. A group of Aryans followed the sun westward from the Caucasus to the area of northern Europe we now call Germany. Rather than mate with lesser-blooded peoples, they killed them. By eradicating the others, the Aryans maintained the purity of their blood. Centuries later, in the dark German forests, the myth continued, and the pure Aryan evolved into an even higher being, the Teuton. The clever Teuton demonstrated a unique genius for political organization. He paid no homage to kings or emperors. Instead, the Teuton consulted democratically among his own kind and slowly created embryonic institutions of liberty that would later manifest themselves elsewhere. So the original documentation of the Teuton was the book Germania, which was written circa around AD 98 by the Roman historian Caius Cornelius Tacitus. And in Germania, Tacitus wrote that long ago, quote, "The peoples of Germany were a race untainted by intermarriage with other races, a peculiar people and pure, like no one but themselves, with a high moral code and a profound love of freedom and individual rights. Important decisions were made by the whole community." So the Teutons spread out from the German forests, going south to Greece, Italy, and Spain. And they did the same as earlier Aryans. The inferior blood of the darker Mediterranean races polluted the superior blood of the white Teuton. And apparently this is a history term called the history of dissolution and non-democratic impulses. Some Teutons followed the sun to the west and sailed across the English Channel and landed on what would become the British Isles. Lesser races populated these islands, and had the Teutons spread with these non-Aryans, their pure blood would have been sullied, and the great flow of civilization would have come to a halt. In 1906, Teddy Roosevelt wrote, "The world would have halted had it not been for the Teutonic conquests in alien lands." But luckily for world civilization, these Teutons obeyed their instincts. By methodical slaughter of native men, women, and children, they kept themselves pure. As these Germanic tribes spread westward and northerly, they gradually became known as Anglo-Saxons, a compound of two Germanic tribal names. Let me get this little box away here. Okay. The Anglo-Saxon myth of white superiority hardened in 1500 when King Henry VIII broke with the Pope to create the Church of England. Royal propagandists blitzed the king's subjects with the idea that the new Anglican Church was not a break with tradition, but a return to a better time. Henry promoted the Church of England to his subjects as a reconnection to a purer Anglo-Saxon tradition that had existed before the Norman conquest of 1066. The success of the king's argument is revealed by an English pamphleteer writing in 1689 that those seeking wisdom in government should look to Tacitus, and as far as Germany, to learn our English Constitution. So these are the three laws of civilization according to Anglo-Saxonism. Number one, the white race founded all civilization. Number two, when the white race maintains its whiteness, civilization is maintained. Number three, when the white race loses its whiteness, civilization is lost. So this is a book that Reginald Horseman wrote on the idea of manifest destiny and the origins of American racial Anglo-Saxonism. Highly recommended reading. So certain whites in the New World believed that they were acting as Englishmen contending for principles of popular government, freedom and liberty introduced into England more than 1,000 years before by the high-minded, freedom-loving Anglo-Saxons from the woods of Germany. Now we're moving ahead to the colonial times. In 1745, Samuel Squire wrote an inquiry into the foundation of the English Constitution. And in this tract, he wrote, the colonists learned about the ideas of Tacitus and the invincible love of liberty that existed amidst the democratic Teutons. Bishop Berkeley, okay, the 18th century philosopher, wrote a poem, okay? This is part of it. Westward, we're talking about westward expansion for the United States. Westward, the course of empire takes its way. The first 4 acts already passed. A 5th shall close the drama of the day. Time's noblest offspring is the last. Now, Bishop Berkeley, okay, is a very interesting fellow. He was born in England and then he moved to the United States. He landed near Newport, Rhode Island, and he bought a plantation in Rhode Island at Middletown, the famous Whitehall. And he bought, Bishop Berkeley, he bought several enslaved Africans to work on the plantation. And then in today's time, 2023, Trinity College in Dublin removed Berkeley's name from one of its libraries because of his slave ownership and his active defense of slavery. But Berkeley University out in California is also named after Bishop Berkeley. When Berkeley visited America, he didn't stay there for long, but he practiced some friendships, among them with the American educator Samuel Johnson, and they corresponded. And Johnson then convinced Berkeley to establish a scholarship program at Yale and donate a large number of books, as well as his plantation to the college when Berkeley went back to England. So, okay, so his ideas or his influence was quite big in the United States. So just a little idea here. He obviously also believed in this Teutonic thing. Thomas Jefferson wrote a summary view of the rights of British America in 1774. You see it here on the right. And Jefferson refers to God twice in this text, but he talks about the Saxon ancestors 6 times. And he's calling for a freer hand from the king. And Jefferson writes of their shared Saxon ancestors who had left their native wilds and woods in the north of Europe, had taken the island of Britain, and had established there that system of laws which has so long been the glory and protection of that country. And Jefferson argued that since the original Saxons were ruled by no superior and were not subject to feudal conditions, the king should lighten his hold on his American colonies. In 1776, Jefferson wrote that he envisioned a new country warmed by the Aryan sun. And he says, has not every restitution of the ancient Saxon laws had happy effects? Is it not better now that we return at once into that happy system of our ancestors, the wisest and most perfect ever yet devised by the wit of man, as it stood before the 8th century? So he wrote this. This was in a letter, I think, to John Adams. There was a lively debate among the colonists to figure out what the United States seal should be. And And these are proposals for the back of the seal from Benjamin Franklin and from Jefferson. Okay, so Jefferson's ideas of the seal were very similar to Franklin's, but in addition to the emblem of Moses and Pharaoh, as you can see here on the right, you see Moses and Pharaoh, Moses parting the sea to let the enslaved Jewish people escape. Jefferson proposed on the reverse an image of Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs from whom we claim the honor of being descendant and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. Now, these are completely diametrically opposed ideas. Benjamin Franklin features the liberation of Jewish slaves by Moses guiding them to the promised land, and Jefferson is showing the subjugation of peoples by the Anglo-Saxon chieftains. So you can see the difference of philosophy in these two. Thomas Gossett wrote a book called Race, the History of an Idea in America, and he wrote in that, one does not have to read very far in the writings of 19th century social scientists to discover the immense influence of race theories among them. In studying human societies, they generally assume that we were also studying innate racial character, which of course is closely connected to this whole idea that Anglo-Saxon white people are superior. So this is another fellow, Congressman William F. L. Giles of Maryland, and he announced the Aryans' intention. He said, "We must march from ocean to ocean, straight to the Pacific Ocean, and be bounded only by its roaring wave. It is the destiny of the white race. It is the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon race." Now, who is William Giles? He was an officer of the American Colonization Society for more than 30 years. And he was as one of the commissioners of the state of Maryland. He supervised the emigration of the free blacks to Liberia. Send them back. We don't want them. So we're going to go a little bit into this race history. Samuel George Morton, okay. He was actually born in Scotland, okay. He attended medical school at Scotland's Edinburgh University. And this was one of Europe's leading universities and a center for discussion of brain function, race theory, and racial anatomy, okay. And he was an anatomist, natural historian, and member of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. And he came to the United States. So, okay, he was one of the America's leading phrenologists. White Christian phrenologists observed that the Caucasian skull was the most symmetrical, and since the circle was the most beautiful shape in nature, it followed that this cranium was the original type created by God. Samuel Morton, he collected the world's largest skull collection. And what he did is to calculate the brain size. He sealed all but one of the skull's opening and then filled it with mustard seeds. And then he weighted the seed. And then he correlated the amount of mustard seed with intelligence, morality, cultural development, and national character. Okay. And his experiments proved that 84 cubic inches of Indian brain had to compete against and would eventually succumb before 96 cubic inches of Teuton brain. And this comforted many Americans, for now they could find God's hand and not their own directing the extinction of the Indian. nice justification, right? God created smaller brains for Indians, and therefore we can exterminate them. So in fact, the funny thing is, in fact, the white skulls that Morton had examined nearly all belonged to white men who had been hanged as felons. It would have been just as logical to conclude that a large head indicated criminal tendencies. Apparently he was confronted about that, and he said, well, okay, in that case, the skulls of non-criminal whites would be even larger. So phrenology was widespread, okay, among academia. Here is another guy, Herbert Spencer, and his name is virtually synonymous with social Darwinism, and he is the one who coined the term survival of the fittest. His social theory applies the law of the survival of the fittest to society and is integrally related to the 19th century rise in scientific racism. He wrote a book, a very famous book called Social Statics, and he argued that imperialism had served civilization by clearing the inferior races of the earth. Quote, the forces which are working out the great scheme of perfect happiness, taking no account of incidental suffering, exterminate such sections of mankind as stand in their way. Be he human or be he brute, the hindrance must be got rid of. But in the same work, he also goes on to say that the incidental evolutionary benefits derived from such barbarous practices do not serve as justification for them going forward. So he's kind of covering his behind. Here's another one, John Fiske, professor of American history. He was teaching at Harvard. He lectured on philosophy and history. He was assistant librarian, elected member of the board of overseers. He lectured on American history at University College in London. He lectured at the Royal Institution of Great Britain. He lectured annually on American history at Washington University in St. Louis. He held a professorship of American history at Washington University in St. Louis. He gave many hundreds of lectures, chiefly upon American history, in the principal cities of the United States and Great Britain. And this 19th century enthusiasm for brain size as a simple measure of human performance, championed by scientists including Darwin's cousin Francis Galton and the French neurologist Paul Braca, led Fiske to believe in the racial superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. So he was teaching this, okay, at all these different universities, and he was teaching this and writing about it. He was well known. So this is a graphic, okay? Professor John Fiske flies the evolution kite in America. So there are apparently 4 stages of the Aryan race. Okay, first is the savage, disorganized, utter chaos reigned. Okay, the second is the barbarian, who made valuable contributions to civilization. It's a Genghis Khan-like stage that the barbarian virtues were formed. Okay, I think Genghis Khan-like stage that refer here to the normal notion of Genghis Khan, that people, the prejudice notion of Genghis Khan. Barbarian virtues were the fighting qualities by which a race advanced and protected its flank. In 1899, Governor Theodore Roosevelt of New York wrote to psychologist G. Stanley Hill. He said, over sentimentality, over softness, and mushiness are the great dangers of this age and this people. Unless we keep the barbarian virtues, gaining the civilized ones will be of little avail. Thirdly, the civilized man, he loves peace, but when provoked could manifest his barbarian virtues. And fourth, the over-civilized man, a step over the cliff. Barbarian virtues were replaced by the easy life. Modern American life was getting soft. Now, okay, ask yourself, which stage are you supposed to be in? So here on the left, the over-civilized man, on the computer desk, not doing physical labor, having warmth, okay, having good dinners, restaurants, don't need to labor for your food anymore. And on the right, civilized man, hunter, farmer, just physically involved in his life. Then you had the role of missionary societies also, okay, plugging away at this Anglo-Saxon superiority nonsense. Okay, several Protestant faiths formed missionary societies in the years after the Civil War, seeking to expand their reach, particularly in Asia. They were influenced by such works as the book by Reverend Josiah Strong. The book is called Our Country, Its Possible Future and Its Present Crisis. And because of this influence, missionaries sought to spread the gospel throughout the country and abroad. Not everybody, not all missionaries believed what Reverend Josiah Strong was writing. I need to emphasize that. But some missionaries conflated Christian ethics with American virtues and began to spread both gospels with zeal, believing the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. So here's Josiah Strong. He's the founder of the Social Gospel Movement and League of Social Services. He was a congregational minister and head of the influential American Evangelical Alliance. He was a personal friend of Theodore Roosevelt. And he known for the influence of his writings in rationalizing imperialism. He argued that the Anglo-Saxon is the representative of two great ideas, which are closely related. One of them is that of civil liberty. Nearly all of the civil liberty of the world is enjoyed by Anglo-Saxons, the English, the British colonists, and the people of the United States. The other great idea of which the Anglo-Saxon is the exponent is that of a pure spiritual Christianity. And he went on, it follows then that the Anglo-Saxon, as the great representative of these two ideas, the depository of these two greatest blessings, sustains peculiar relations to the world's future, is divinely commissioned to be, in a peculiar sense, his brother's keeper. And you had, besides the missionary, you had the social reformers. The social reformers of the early progressive area, which runs from 1890s to 1920s, they also performed work abroad, mirrored the missionaries, and they were very much influenced by the recent scholarships on race-based intelligence, and they embraced the implications of social Darwinist theory and Anglo-Saxonism that alleged inferior races were destined to poverty on account of their lower evolutionary status. And while certainly not all reformers espoused a racist view of intelligence and civilization, many of these reformers believed that the Anglo-Saxon race was mentally superior to others and owed the presumed less evolved populations their stewardship and social uplift. A service the British writer Rudyard Kipling termed the white man's burden. And here is a cartoon from Judge magazine about the white man's burden. Here we have another one, Goldwin Smith. lived from 1823 to 1910. He was professor of modern history at the University of Oxford. He then he went to Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, teaching there. And then, I didn't want to leave out our Canadians. Then he moved to Toronto to live with relatives. He was a critic of imperialism. He opposed Irish home rule. He opposed women's suffrage, but he held Anglo-Saxonist and anti-Semitic views. And he was somewhat of an academic celebrity. His lectures were sometimes printed in New York newspapers. This is one of his quotes, okay? The Jewish objective, i.e. preoccupation with money-making, has always been the same since Roman times. We, the Anglo-Saxons, regard our race as superior to all humanity, and we do not seek our ultimate union with other races, but our final triumph over them. So I've gone in detail through the mindset, the ideology that was pushed in the 19th century in the Americas and Great Britain. This superiority of the Anglo-Saxon Teutonic race. So, okay, here are just a few victims of the Anglo-Saxon manliness craze. Mexico, Cuba, Hawaii, Korea, Philippines, Japan. I am going in my second part of my lecture. I will go through Cuba, Hawaii, Philippines, to tell how this happened. Yeah. So, okay, how to combat over-civilization, the fourth stage of Anglo-Saxonism. All right. There's something called muscular Christianity. Healthiness, manliness, athletic ability, and courage in battle distinguished muscular Christianity. The argument was that Christ was not gently, saintly, and long-suffering, but a soldier of vigor and righteousness. This concept of muscular Christianity led later on to the founding of the Young Men's Christian Association, and also led to led to composition of virile religious anthems like the Onward Christian Soldiers anthem. There was also the nature cure to combat over-civilization, romps in the woods that will make a boy manlier and therefore purer, okay? And this cure was later on vigorously followed by the Wandervogel movement in Europe in the 1920s, and then picked up by the Nazis and implemented through their Hitler Youth program, which took place a lot out in nature. Theodore Roosevelt Sr., he took his children to the great outdoors for exercise, and he helped the Children's Aid Society export 90,000 poor children to the Midwest countryside. I have no idea why children in the Children's Aid Society would have to combat over-civilization, but I'll leave that to you to answer. So, in 1893, there was a very important book published, or thesis published, I should say, by Professor Frederick Jackson Turner. And he taught at the University of Wisconsin and Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. And he developed something called the Frontier Thesis, entitled The Significance of the Frontier in American History. It was read before the American Historical Association in Chicago during the World's Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair. He believed The spirit and success of the United States was associated directly with the country's westward expansion. And you can see here the cover of his book, of course, is the picture I showed to you earlier, American Progress by Gast. Okay, so he says in his book, now, 4 centuries from the discovery of America, at the end of 100 years of life under the Constitution, the frontier has gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history. So no more frontier, because we filled out all the space from east to west. Turner announced, and I'm going a little bit more in detail here with the frontier thesis. He announced in 1893 that American democracy was largely formed by the American frontier at the Chicago's World Columbian Exposition. He noted that for nearly 3 centuries, the dominant fact in American life has been expansion. He continued, American energy will continually demand a wider field for its exercise. He concluded that the demands for a vigorous foreign policy, for an interoceanic canal, for a revival of our power upon our seas, and for the extension of American influence to outlying islands and adjoining countries are indications that the forces of expansion will continue. Turner's thesis was enormously influential at the time, but subsequently has been widely criticized by historians. Specifically, the thesis underscores the pervasive racism and disregard for the indigenous communities, cultures, and individuals in the American borderlands and beyond. So, okay. The idea that Turner's idea that the American frontier was gone stunned Western white Christians. But Theodore Roosevelt was one of the first to sense the revolutionary qualities of Turner's thesis. He said, or actually, John Judis, in his book, The Folly of Empire, what George W. Bush could learn from Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, he said that for Roosevelt, the closing of the frontier meant the loss of those elements in national life that made Americans virile and vigorous, stimulated their taste and aptitude for competition, and gave them a strong and unifying sense of racial solidarity. Roosevelt worried that with the absence of battle, Americans would grow soft and over-civilized and unable to defend themselves against a new masterful race that still carried within the fighting qualities of the barbarian. So remember those 4 stages of Anglo-Saxonism. Now here's another fellow, okay, Brooks Adams, lived from 1848 to 1927. He further dramatized the consequences of the nation's loss of its frontier in his The Law of Civilization and Decay, which he wrote in 1895. And Adam argues that social movement, as in colonization and industrialization, leads to consolidation. Consolidation, in turn, creates a comparative advantage for frugality versus artistic expression. Okay? Because Adams believed that these traits of the mind were heritable, he argues that consolidation led to the domination of one people over another, and the domination of one civilization over another. And the first print of the book sold out within 3 months in England. And Theodore Roosevelt, a friend of Adams, who was then serving as New York City Police Commissioner, gave the book a mostly positive review in the forum, though he emphatically dissented from portions of its theses. So he didn't agree with everything that Brooks Adams wrote. But we'll get to that. So in 1893, the Great Depression hit. The United States economy was in the worst depression ever. 642 banks closed, 16,000 companies shuttered their doors. The most actively traded company on the New York Stock Exchange, the National Courage, went belly up. On August 15, 1893, Northern Pacific Railroad went bankrupt. 2 months later, the Union Pacific Railroad did the same. 4 million workers were idle, which was more than 1/4 of a labor force of 15 million. And of course, at that time, there was no government support available for the unemployed. So this is a poster on the left here, okay, showing trying to activate people. So, okay, anxiety about over-civilization increased. The Depression of 1893 exacerbated anxieties about manhood, for unemployment resulting from the Depression led to fears of male dependency. Rather than providing for their families as men were expected to do, thousands failed to fulfill this basic male responsibility. So the combination, what is the solution to this? Fear, okay? Anxiety about over-civilization, the frontier being gone, okay? Male dependency. What's the solution to all of this? Okay, overseas expansion. Battling others for their land would enhance the American male's barbarian virtues and secure profitable markets, and the United States would once again have a frontier in which to hone its Teutonic blade. So, which brings us to Teddy Roosevelt Jr. Let me have a drink of water here. So I just went, all these slides I went through, setting up or giving you an idea of what the ideology among the ruling elite was, okay, in America at the time. This picture, I chose it because I just thought it was funny because it was so typical Teddy Roosevelt. It shows Roosevelt making corrections to a portrait of George Washington. And George Washington had an epitaph called first in war, first in peace, and first in the heart of his countrymen. And Theodore thought, or the cartoonist thought it would be more applicable to write second. So second in war, second in peace, and second in the heart of his countrymen, because he himself, Roosevelt, arrogantly considered himself to be America's greatest leader. So this is pretty funny, I thought. Anyway, these are the parents of Teddy Roosevelt Jr. On the left, you see Martha Bullock Roosevelt. She's a Southern belle. Her family owned an enormous plantation, and she was unable to adjust to the chilly northern climes and her stern husband's ways and New York society. She was usually ill and required constant care. So, prime example of over-civilized man or woman. Okay, and on the right you see Theodore Roosevelt Sr., and he prescribed the Bible for his sons' minds and barbells for their bodies. Gotta have muscular Christianity. So he was born, Theodore Roosevelt was born in a New York City mansion in October 1858, among the 7th generation of Roosevelts born on Manhattan Island. He had an older sister named Anna, a younger brother named Elliot, and a younger sister named Corinne. The first Roosevelts, Klaas Martensen van Roosevelt, had immigrated from Holland in 1649. And Klaas and his descendants acquired vast tracts of land in the Hudson River Valley north of Manhattan, and they were worked by slaves. 200 years later, the Roosevelt financial empire included vast holdings of stock, real estate, insurance, banking, and mining. Roosevelts had been elected as congressmen and appointed as judges. Roosevelt time and money helped create institutions such as Chemical National Bank, Roosevelt Hospital, Central Park, the American Museum of Natural History, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Children's Aid Society, which was mentioned before. This is Theodore Roosevelt Jr., aged 11. So Martha, okay, Teddy's mother was a clear example of within the Roosevelt home of the over-civilized woman. And unfortunately, Teddy seemed to be a prime example of an over-civilized boy. He was a scrawny, sickly specimen who needed eyeglasses to see his own hands and who suffered from terrifying asthma attacks that at times left him an invalid. Theodore Sr. installed gymnastic equipment on the back piazza of the mansion, but Teddy's health was too fragile for a full regimen. At 8 years old, he and his brother Elliot were sent to an outside tutor. Elliot flourished, but sickly and nervous Teddy had to be schooled from home. So he did not go to an outside tutor. The tutor came to him. With his mother, he visited such fashionable health resorts as New Lebanon, Saratoga, Old Sweet Springs, and White Silver Springs. And these elite watering holes were places where the effete became even more over-civilized. So young Teddy was isolated, homebound, often bedridden, and he read really widely, and he began to dream that he could fight and explore side by side with his literary heroes. Unfortunately, the reading material that he read was not very good, okay? He read dime novels. They were full of racial stereotypes. The blacks were dim-witted, subservient, and comical. The Indians were treacherous, immoral creatures. The heroes were inevitably blonde, blue-eyed frontiersmen who stood for righteousness. So these are some of the books that Theodore Roosevelt would read when he was a child. He loved the Main Read books. They were tales of gruesome combat to the death. He also loved the saga of King Olaf, which was written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, which celebrated Teutonic white supremacy. And, okay, he read the Nibelungenlied, the German Iliad, which praised Teutonic virility. And Roosevelt quoted the work for the rest of his life. His biographer, Edmund Morris, thought the Nibelungenlied so central to Teddy's life that he used phrases from it as aphorisms to begin each chapter of his first Roosevelt biography. So this is what stamped, okay, Teddy's mind as a young child. Teddy never attended grade school or high school. He was completely isolated from the outside world. In 1876, at the age of 18 years old, he attended Harvard University in Cambridge. And Teddy's anatomy professor, William James, urged his students to regard manliness as their highest ideal. This was elusive to Teddy. He was conscious of his status as a gentleman, cautious in his choice of friends, and quick to join socially prominent campus organizations. Roosevelt carefully researched the backgrounds of potential friends and considered only a few to be gentlemen. Can you imagine that? Okay, I never thought that anybody would do that. Research potential friends. Edmund Morris says he not only relished the company of rich young men, but moved immediately into the ranks of the very richest and the most arrogantly fashionable. So, growing up among the highborn wealthy, there's a tradition, and after you graduate from college, you take off on a thrilling adventure like a sea voyage, and then you turn it into a book. However, there was a problem. Teddy had no personal history, which he could capitalize on to write a book. Okay, he couldn't write about his father, because his father had bought his way out of the Civil War. He couldn't write about his uncles because his maternal Bullock uncles had been Confederate secret agents. Uncle Jimmy Bullock was considered to be a traitor to his country as a result of his anti-Union activities in the Civil War. He faced arrest in the United States and evaded American justice by living in England, where he's buried. And he had served 14 years in the US Navy before the Civil War. Uncle Jimmy's tales about how the US Navy bested England and the necessity of naval preparedness made a big impression on Teddy. While he was still an undergraduate, Roosevelt began writing the book The Naval War of 1812. Though he graduated from Harvard in 1880 with the manuscript was still incomplete. So that was his choice of the book, writing a book. The Naval War of 1812. So here is Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy in the circle there, and his uncles above him, okay? Uncle Jimmy became a Confederate secret agent in England and the South's most dangerous man in Europe. He sold cotton to Britain in exchange for acquiring ships for the Confederate Navy. And during his time in Liverpool, James arranged for the construction and covert purchase of the commerce raiders CSS Alabama, Florida, and Shenandoah. So, okay. Teachers at Harvard, okay. You had Francis Parkman Jr., graduated from Harvard in 1845, and he taught there. And Roosevelt would dedicate his Winning of the West book series to Parkman, because Parkman had once written, the Germanic race, and especially the Anglo-Saxon branch of it, is peculiarly masculine and therefore peculiarly fitted for self-government. It submits its action habitually to the guidance of reason and has the judicial faculty of seeing both sides of a question. And another one of his professors was Nathaniel Southgate Shaler, who founded the Harvard's Natural History Society. Teddy Roosevelt was elected vice president to that society. Professor Shaler wrote, Warren Zimmerman wrote about him. One of the most respected professors on the faculty, taught white supremacy based on the racial heritage of England, finding non-Aryan people lacking in the correct ancestral experience and impossible to Americanize. So, Teddy's teachers. At Columbia, as at Harvard, Teddy absorbed a scholarly, reasoned case for American world domination based upon the color of his skin, and thus had acquired the prism through which he would judge people, events, and nations throughout his life. Thomas Dyer wrote about Roosevelt and the idea of race. Teddy Roosevelt viewed the entire breadth of the American past through a racial lens, with constant, almost compulsive attention to underlying racial themes. He researched, analyzed, and synthesized the raw materials of history. The force of race in history occupied a singularly important place in Roosevelt's broad intellectual outlook. In fact, race provided him with a window on the past through which he could examine the grand principles of historical development. None of human history really meant much, Roosevelt believed, if racial history were not thoroughly understood first. The Teuton myth. Another professor at Columbia was John William Burgess. Okay, he taught political science at Columbia, and he was Teddy Roosevelt's favorite teacher. Burgess taught that the United States Constitution was the modern expression of Anglo-Saxon Teutonic political genius, a genius which had originated in the Black Forest of Germany, spread through England and North America, and expressed itself in the Magna Carta, the Glorious Revolution, and the American Revolution. Burgess thought it was the mission of the white man to spread democracy around the world, and that since the state was an invention of the Teutons, the organs of state should be controlled only by those with Teutonic blood. No dark others need apply. So college finished and his mind brainwashed. Okay, that's my take. Wealthy and idle, Teddy headed off on vacation. As a child, Teddy had shot animals in a number of eastern states in Europe and in Egypt. He had recently engaged himself to Alice Lee. So he went on a luxury hunting expedition with his brother Elliot to the Dakota Territory. And Teddy invested there $10,000 in the Teschmaker and Debillier Cattle Company. They were running herds on the ranges north of Cheyenne, so in the Dakota territories. So that's Ranchman Terry now, okay? Roosevelt married Alice on his 22nd birthday, and several months later, in May of 1881, the newlyweds left for a costly 5 months honeymoon in Europe, on which he finished his Naval War of 1812. On his honeymoon, he finished the book. It was published in 1882. So Roosevelt's first book, he wrote many books. First book was a bold concoction of a call for naval preparedness and Harvard's Follow the Sun dogma. The book later became required reading at the Naval Academy in Annapolis. In its first chapter, Teddy made clear the racial identity of the contestants. He noted differing levels of ability among combatants according to the purity of their Aryanized blood. Norsemen, very Teutonic, made excellent sailors and fighters. The non-Teutonic Portuguese and Italians did not, as a rule, make the best kind of seamen because they were treacherous, fond of the knife, less ready with their hands, and likely to lose either their wits or their courage when in a tight place. The finest sailors of all were the ones who had followed the sun furthest west. The stern school in which the American was brought up forced him into habits of independent thought and action, which it was impossible that the more protected Briton to possess. He was shrewd, quiet, and rather moral. There could not have been better material for a fighting crew. So this book, The Naval War of 1812, made Teddy a nationally recognized advocate of a muscular navy. In November of 1881, Teddy Roosevelt became elected state assemblyman. He was the youngest man in the legislature in New York. He was brimming with self-importance and ambition. And he was chagrined to discover that despite his intelligence, competence, and the real legislative success, no one took him seriously. Because politics in Albany in the 19th century was a game played by beer and whiskey drinking men, not aristocrats. The more strenuously he labored to play a man's part in politics, the more his opponents derided his manhood. on the daily newspaper lampooned Roosevelt as the quintessence of effeminacy. They nicknamed him Weakling, Jane Dandy, Pumpkin Lily, and the exquisite Mr. Roosevelt. They ridiculed his high voice, tight pants, and fancy clothing. Several began referring to him by the name of the well-known homosexual Oscar Wilde, and one actually alleged, in a less than veiled phallic allusion, that Roosevelt was given to sucking the knob of an ivory cane. While Teddy Roosevelt might consider himself a manly man, it was becoming humiliatingly clear that others considered him effeminate. But being seen as effeminate was a death sentence for an aspiring politician. So clearly this effeminate dude image would have to go, okay? And I read an account of Teddy's first impression when he appeared on the assembly room, and he was dressed in a purple satin suit and speaking in a high-pitched Harvard voice. And the other assemblymen just took a look at the rich kid and they laughed. So for Roosevelt, that was unacceptable. The effeminate dude image would have to go. So he embarked on the remake of Teddy Roosevelt, okay? And Roosevelt, okay, set out to make himself, or to make people believe that he was a manly man. In his book, The Winning of the West, he wrote, "For a number of years, I spent most of my time, complete lie, on the frontier and lived and worked like any other frontiersman. We guarded our herds of branded cattle and shaggy horses, hunted bear, bison, elk, and deer, established civil government, and put down evildoers, white and red, exactly as did the pioneers." In fact, Roosevelt commuted west aboard deluxe Pullman cars, staying for short periods of time to check on his investments and gather material for his books. And ranchman Teddy was to Theodore Roosevelt what Buffalo Bill was to William Cody, a spectacular fiction concocted with an audience in mind. Until his death, Teddy would repeat these mythical accounts of his Western adventures, passing them along as facts. But despite his claims to the contrary, Teddy Roosevelt spent the majority of his Western years in Manhattan. So, okay, during the years 1884 to 1901, there was a big show on the road, William Cody's Buffalo Bill's Wild West, A History of American Civilization, which traveled from city to city. Okay, it was a leading cultural sensation in the United States. And Buffalo Bill, okay, was the embodiment of the blonde Aryan who sought civilization as he race-cleansed his way west. Recognizing that a frontier adventure of his own could remedy his wimpish reputation, Roosevelt galloped west, following Buffalo Bill's track. In 1884, Teddy Roosevelt boasted to the New York Tribune, "It would electrify some of my friends who have accused me of presenting the kid-gloved elements in politics if they could see me galloping over the plains, day in and day out, clad in a buckskin shirt and leather chaparajos, with a big sombrero on my head." So, William Cody's Buffalo Bill was a hunter. Theodore Roosevelt's ranchman Teddy was a rancher, the next step up on the evolutionary ladder, as understood in the agrarian 19th century. The hunter Buffalo Bill secures the wilderness and the rancher tames it. Theodore Roosevelt was not the only rich Eastern who went west in pursuit of fame. The author Owen Wister, who wrote The Virginian, and the sculptor Frederick Remington were also rich East Coast men who went west via elegant Pullman coaches and grand hotels, and then they spun their short visits into careers as Western manly men. So, okay, this is a bit of a timeline, okay, of Roosevelt's political career. So in 81, he was elected to New York State Assembly. In 82, he published his book. He also joined the National Guard and he was commissioned second lieutenant. In 83, he was elected Speaker of the Republican Assembly and Minority Leader. In 84, tragedy struck. His mother and his wife died on the same day while he was out in the Dakotas. Actually, he never talked about his wife publicly again, his first wife publicly again. The wife died in childbirth, and the child survived. That was Alice. In 84, in June, he became a delegate to the Republican National Convention, and he worked on the Blaine presidential campaign, in which Blaine was, forgot now, he's successful. In 86, he ran for mayor of New York City, lost that race. 89, he became U.S. Civil Service Commissioner in Washington, D.C. And then in 95, 6 years later, he was for 6 years. He resigned as Civil Service Commission to become Police Commissioner of New York City, and then became the elected president of the Board of Police Commissioners. This was a big jump, okay? You were, as president of the Board of Police Commissioners, you were entirely making policy yourself, but it was very, very full of graft and corruption, okay? It was terrible. He became appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by President William McKinley. So when Roosevelt was police commissioner, he had just lost, he lost an election for mayor of New York City and stayed out of politics for 3 years, writing books and so on. Then in 89, he was appointed by President Benjamin Harrison to the United States Civil Service Commission, served for 6 years there, overseeing the reform of the nation's civil service. There was a lot of corruption in the civil service, and there was a lot of, nepotism, you can call it now, in the government in Washington, D.C. In 95, a series of public hearings exposed widespread graft in the New York City Police Department. The Mayor Strong, came to Roosevelt and proposed that he should be the head of the sanitation department, and Roosevelt declined that. That was not a clean enough job for him. So then he was offered the post on the Board of Police Commissioners, which Roosevelt accepted. But there were many, many, many conflicts. So, for example, one of the widely publicized crusades was to close the saloons on Sunday. However, there's a problem because that was the only day when many working men could socialize in them, because people at that time were still working 6 days a week. This provoked a lively public backlash. Not only were the saloons there for people to drink, but also the political machinations were all going on in the saloons. So with closing them on Sunday, there was no opportunity to organize politically. Roosevelt wrote about the police board. He said, "The work of the police board is as grimy as all work for municipal reform over here. It's as grimy as all work for municipal reform over here must be for some decades to come. And it is inconceivably arduous, disheartening, and irritating having to deal with all these people. So in 1896, McKinley was the Republican Party's presidential nominee. Roosevelt knew if he worked to ensure McKinley's election, he might receive a high-level job in the new administration. So he went out and campaigned for McKinley in a number of states. And then he enlisted powerful friends to help him lobby the president-elect for the post of Assistant Secretary of the Navy. McKinley, however, was hesitant. He said, "I want peace. And I am told that your friend Theodore, who I know only slightly, is always getting into rows with everybody. I'm afraid he's too pugnacious." So, for example, okay, at that time, the newspaper carried reports of an almost total breakdown of discipline in the police force in New York. There were new outbreaks of corruption, tearful threats of resignation. It was the big scandal, an open scandal at the police headquarters, very well known in the newspapers. And Roosevelt needed to get out of there, and he engaged his friends to just lobby like crazy for his appointment. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge wrote to Teddy, "The absolute only thing I can hear adverse is that there is a fear that you will want to fight somebody at once." So I guess his friends' lobbying paid off. On April 6th, 1897, Theodore Roosevelt was nominated for Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he had promised his Secretary of the Navy, John Long, that he would be entirely loyal and subordinate. Though to his sister, Roosevelt confided, "I am a quietly rampant Cuba Libre man." So we're getting to the end of the presentation, first part presentation here. So William McKinley was president from 1897 to 1901. He was the last US president to have served in the Civil War. The war left him an indelible impression. Yet his administration led the US in the Spanish-American War, overseeing a period of American expansionism with the annexation of Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Hawaii. So how did this happen? And that's what we're going to talk about in my second presentation. So the stage is set for part 2. And here you can see a picture, a cartoon of Roosevelt with his big stick. Okay. And we're going to discuss how was the manifest destiny of the Monroe Doctrine perverted into the manifest destiny of the Roosevelt Corollary. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for that, Magdalena. That was every time I hear masculine Christianity, it just makes me laugh. And the same, the muscular Navy. But I guess you think of Teddy Roosevelt and you think of the bully, and that's really what it comes around to. So, okay, but now if anyone has any questions, just put them in the chat, and I can ask. And I think our first question is from Uva. Uva, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Magdalena, for this really fascinating talk in terms of the depth of detail you went into to really give me a much better understanding of this guy's psychological and general personality. So I was wondering, and maybe this will come in the second part, because his political career is only just taking off as we are here at the end of part 1, and so you may want to explain this in part 2. But my question was, Is it a correct understanding that Roosevelt was so much driven by his own frailty and weakness to compensate for this, that he was his own political machine, or was he already involved in a bigger network which helped him to get where he eventually got?
Well, okay, thank you for that question. So yes, I mean, the idea that he was this over-civilized boy that grew into a man and he had to prove himself over and over definitely played a role. But also this stuff that he read, right? This Anglo-Saxon superiority. This was, I think, a massive influence in forming his thoughts and his ideas and his philosophy. But it was also all around him. I mean, remember, he belonged to the upper elite of New York, and he went to Harvard, he went to, Columbia, and he was inundated by the professors with all this nonsense, right? Which was common philosophy of at the time, believing in this stuff. And the thing is that because it was so common among the circles that he frequented or that he was part of, it stirred kind of everything that he was doing. And what was I going to say? There was another thought. Okay. And also, Roosevelt was a master in manipulation, okay, in media. I think he was one of the first people who recognized that propaganda, what effect propaganda could have. In the second part, for example, I show you a picture of Teddy Roosevelt as a Rough Rider, the Rough Rider Teddy Roosevelt, which is when he went to Cuba. Okay, you would think he would have any uniform on. No, his uniform was tailored by Brooks Brothers. He had a tailored uniform to go and portray himself as the Rough Rider, right? But he made sure that he always had these pictures. And the pictures were not done out in the wild, in the West, for example. They were done in the studio. Very deliberate, set up to create this propaganda, this idea, this image of himself as being the manly man, muscular Christianity, okay? The funny part about this whole thing, it made clear in my mind, because I could never understand, how could you call yourself a Christian and then support slavery? I could never, it didn't fit in my thinking, the way I got brought up, right? And now that I understand this whole Anglo-Saxonism and this Teutonic myth and all this stuff, I understand now why I don't accept it, okay? But I understand now where all this garbage comes from, right? I hope that answered your question. We'll see a lot more. I mean, the propaganda apparatus of Teddy Roosevelt I think he was one of the first presidents who really understood how to work the machine, how to work the newspapers and so forth.
Thank you.
Okay, and let's see, there's a question, a number of questions. Grace left a number. Grace, are you still there? She said she might have to up off. If not, I can read them, and she's okay. I'll read them. I don't think Grace is there. Thank you for the lecture. I may not be able to stay till the end, but here are my questions. Okay, the first, what were Theodore Roosevelt's view on his own lack of physical prowess, or what he referred to as a lack of manliness? And was there any acknowledgement of this situation on his part?
Okay. I know that since his father had already introduced him to exercise in the backyard with the gym equipment, okay, and so forth, that he tried to overcome this from earliest childhood on. And to a certain degree, he succeeded in it, although he did suffer from asthma all his life. But he played it down quite a bit later on. And of course, I think it was Harvard. He was part of the rowing team, and you actually can find pictures of him, and he looks quite muscular, okay, in my opinion. I think, okay, quite frankly, that this experience in the New York Assembly created a big shock on him, or he was quite, it shocked him to the extent that from then on he was really, really adamant that he would never, 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 never be perceived as being a so-called weakling or a dandy or anything like that. He understood that this was not acceptable.
Okay, thanks for that. Grace has a couple other questions listed, but I think I'll give some other people a chance to ask questions or comment, and we can go back to that later if we have time. PD Lawton made a comment, and PD, if you're there, would you like to go ahead with that? Hope she's still there.
Yeah, they're all on mute, right? Yeah,
Oh,
you have to unmute yourself.
I don't know if she's still here. Maybe not.
Okay, go to the
Okay.
next.
Okay. Let's see. Next. Oh, Martin. Martin said he would like to make a quick comment on his influence on Reagan and Bush Jr.'s people. Martin, if you take yourself off mute, we'll let you talk for up to 4 hours if you want.
We can't hear you, Martin. You have to take the mute off. There you are.
I'm okay now. Yep. I'll try and limit myself to 3.5 hours. How about that? Magdalena, that was wonderful. I mean, I've been reading about this guy most of my life. And at first, I was very attracted by him. And then, of course, I very slowly, all too slowly, woke up to the darker aspects of him. And I'm still learning an awful lot about them. You guys might want to contact James Bradley to give a presentation. He's a friend of mine. I have his contact information. And he's very fearless, and he recognizes, as you say, Magdalena, I agree with you. I've looked at that book too. It's a wonderful book. And in fact, I've proposed to Matt doing a piece on why the US should never have gotten involved in imperialism in East Asia in the first place. And it didn't benefit America. It benefited a few fat cats and megalomaniacs. But the American people and the American industry has never gotten any benefit from 100 years of crazed involvement there. And we threw Korea to be enslaved by Japan. We got involved in China in the most unsuccessful and catastrophic and embarrassing of ways imaginable. And the litany goes on, as we know to this day, but it starts with him, like you say, and James is great on that too. But I came to Washington, it seems like yesterday, of course, and I thought I was already something of an old timer, after all my years back in Ireland and running around doing nothing in particular in my 20s. But I was in my 30s and I thought I was old. And it was the Reagan administration. And I was working for the Washington Times, which is very conservative. So I had a lot of into the Reagan people. And I was amazed whenever I went there. You saw not just Roosevelt's books, but framed portraits of him on the wall of policy makers. Even then, the head of the Agency for International Development, senior officials in the State Department, all over the Pentagon, of course. They never let me into the CIA, probably just as well for me as well, but into their offices. But I would imagine it was there because when you heard these people speak, they would quote him all the time. And I'm old enough to remember in the 60s and 70s, he was regarded as a joke. FDR was the great Roosevelt, and it was seen that FDR completely eclipsed Teddy Roosevelt in his achievements, in the scale of the challenges he faced, everything. And I grew up in that world. But today we have a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier called the Theodore Roosevelt. The only ship in the US Navy called after Franklin Roosevelt is a small, obscure cutter. Now, 70 years ago, the most modern aircraft carrier in the US Navy was named for Franklin Roosevelt. There were no ships named after TR. This is how much, for a long time, I was just naive. I admired FDR much more. It puzzled me that TR could be taken so seriously. He came back in the Reagan era. And Morris's book had a huge amount to do with that. As you know, Magdalena, it's a lovely read. He's a talented writer. But it's all lies. Or rather, he knew when not, and also he knew when not ask questions. I mean, you have just given something I never knew. I don't think anybody knows. I don't think it can be emphasized enough how his Western macho image, which I bought all these years, was a scam. I mean, it was a fake and a phony all along. So this is hugely what you are tackling here. We talk about the legal term fruits of the poisonous tree, and that you have to go back to the roots to see why the fruit turns out to be poisonous even centuries later. Mm-hmm. You are doing that with the insanities we still see in the world today. President Trump very consciously in foreign policy echoes the elitism, the racism, the assumption of American bullyingness, the idea that macho bullying, superficial macho bullying, is an acceptable or even admirable way of dealing with the world. And this comes straight from Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, you're right, I could go on for hours. I will try not to. I have a friend back in Belfast. We worked together in copy desks for 4 years together in the middle of the Civil War in Belfast. We had the building literally blown from under us several times. I mean, we were able to get out, and usually it was skirt things, but it was a stress situation. So you make the friendships you make then and that you keep stick with you. And this guy, my friend Eddie Sterling, happily is still very much with us. But I remember on one occasion, he was reading at the copy desk a book on American history, and there were photographs of Abraham Lincoln and of Theodore Roosevelt grinning as usual. And Eddie just looked at the two pictures and said with his usual Scots-Irish total lack of diplomacy, what an expletive deleted SHIT, pointing to Roosevelt. And then he said, look at the depth of suffering and experience and wisdom on that face, looking at Lincoln. And he said, how could they go from him to him? And of course, that's exactly the question you're explaining to us here right now. So thank you. And the one other thing I'd ask too is, you've already gone into this, but again, if there's anything more you can give us on this business of his masculinity, because he does build himself up physically. His second marriage is long and very happy. He has at least 5 kids. His sons, he loves his kids in his own way, though his eldest daughter is the most interesting one. And when we talk about occult connections, I'd be interested if you've come across any with him. His older daughter was openly boasted all her life of being a practicing witch, and boasted that she had personally murdered President Warren Harding by putting a death curse on him. Not that she had poisoned him or was involved in any assassination plot, but she really believed her own version of voodoo because she hated President Harding, first for occupying the post she was sure her father would come back to in 1921. And of course, he was dead by then anyway. And secondly, by being another William McKinley, by being a good man who sought peace in the most constructive ways and wasn't afraid, like McKinley, to show compassion, which of course was the opposite of Theodore. So if you have anything either on the occult or more on this obsessiveness with him to appear macho, and just at one point I came across a wonderful quote which confirms everything you've been saying. Gore Vidal, who was openly gay, openly an opponent of American empire, openly a champion of American nationalism, a man who sought international peace and understanding, and who was hated by the American establishment all his life. And a genuinely fearless man. One of his essays in one of his books, I think it's in the Second American Revolution, is called, but you can easily find it, in which the title of the essay is Theodore Roosevelt, Sissy. Exactly. So, but again, thank you so much. That was just masterful.
Yes, thank you, Marty. Yeah, this is it really makes me laugh when James Bradley was describing Teddy Roosevelt showing up in the New York State Assembly with this purple velvety suit. Okay, and I'm going like, oh my God, right? So yes, I have not come across. I have been looking. Believe me, I looked if there was any inclination that Teddy Roosevelt was involved with the occult and anything like that, okay, and I could not, okay. However, I do understand that Alice, his oldest daughter, okay, she basically meddled with anything that would upset her father, I think.
Yes.
Okay. She was very, very much into that state of mind, okay. Whatever made her attractive to the press and would make her father upset, she would definitely pursue it. Okay, so yes, I do understand that she was involved in that kind of stuff, and I heard about the curse on Harding. Yes, but I couldn't find anything with Roosevelt being involved in that, in the occultism.
Thank you.
But again, he had a vast circle of, if you want to call them friends, okay, but people that he writes to. He was a very prolific writer. And he would have correspondence with all kinds of people. So I don't think it's out of the sphere of possibilities that he had some pen pals like that. I don't know. Okay, I just think there's a possibility. Obviously, he was this whole idea of this racial superiority. I mean, and it started way, way, way back. I mean. This Anglo-Saxon nonsense. It's just sick, it's sickening.
Okay.
But I wanted to also address it because it made sense for me with the religion, the missionary approach, okay, that some of these missionaries had, and you will see about this in when I talk about Hawaii in the next class. And the approach that the missionaries took in Hawaii, okay, and so forth. This Anglo-Saxon superiority and justification that you can have Christianity with Anglo-Saxonism, it's mind-boggling. It's completely perplexing. Thanks, Marty.
Yeah, that's very good. Very good. I really like the part where you were showing the dichotomy between Benjamin Franklin's outlook for the seal and Jefferson's, where Franklin was showing, the Israelites escaping slavery. And Jefferson has this, wants the Vikings who invaded Britain. Like, it's interesting that a lot of this stuff does go back to, well, maybe not go back to Jefferson, but he was infected with it. Let me put it that way. So, okay, next, Sam. Our good friend Sam has a comment he wishes to make, Madeline.
Yeah, thank you. Magda, it seems like great minds think alike, because I've actually been working on this story from a slightly different angle. I saw an interview with Max Blumenthal on the Judge Andrew Napolitano show a few months ago. And I'm generally a fan of Max Blumenthal's work, and they were talking about how much Trump loves William McKinley, and Max Blumenthal called William McKinley the fanatically imperialist president, William McKinley. So I'm trying to write an article correcting the record. I would challenge Max Blumenthal to demonstrate where William McKinley is a fanatical imperialist through his words or his deeds, and I hope to show exactly the opposite. But what the article is veering into is an exploration of this whole Teddy Roosevelt faction's role in what is typically seen as the imperialist actions of the William McKinley presidency, most notably Cuba and the Philippines. And so, first of all, I just wanted to say, I mentioned very briefly in the article about the Anglo-Saxonism, and you really went so much more into detail. Just a great reference, and a lot of information there which I wasn't aware of, which I will certainly make use of and quote from. So I'll send you my article when it's out, and I'll also certainly restack this presentation when Matt or whoever posts it, because I think it ties in really, really nicely and provides a whole other layer of exposition to the story. And I'm really looking forward to your part 2. I would just say, regarding Martin's question about the occult, Teddy Roosevelt did become initiated into Freemasonry in 1901, right before he became president. And I would say, in regards to Uwe's question, that you cannot understand Teddy Roosevelt's career without understanding that the entirety of Teddy Roosevelt's political career was due to Henry Cabot Lodge.
Yes,
of this
yes,
Boston
yes.
Brahmin family. Literally every appointment that Teddy Roosevelt got was gained through Henry Cabot Lodge. And there was this whole circle in Washington, like Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge were both educated at Harvard by Henry Adams, who was the brother of Brooks Adams, who you mentioned. And yeah, there was this whole grouping in Washington that saw war as necessary for the American rejuvenation, because, as you put it, they saw American civilization becoming too sissy, and that there needed to be a rebirth through more manliness, and only war could achieve this. And there's a lot of other reasons as well for their push for Cuba. But literally, the Philippines happened because the Secretary of the Navy was out, I believe he was sick one day, and it was literally Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge in the Department of the Navy sending out orders all over the globe, but especially to the Asia fleet, where the name is escaping me right now,
Dewey,
but the
Dewey.
admiral in charge,
Dewey.
Dewey, that's right, Dewey, he was a close friend of Roosevelt's, He sent him all kinds of orders to load up on coal and to be prepared as soon as war is declared in Cuba to also go and take the Philippines. And McKinley had nothing to do with the Philippines. He even said,
Damn, Sam, you're taking my fire here. Okay?
You're right. I'll leave it for part 2.
Yeah, that's
to say,
part
great minds think
2.
alike, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's a really important story.
Thanks, Sam. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
I'm going to discuss this. Yes, absolutely. On McKinley, just a little tidbit now. Okay, McKinley did not want to go to war. Definitely. I will go and will show in my second part on how the media played a huge job on McKinley, okay, to get him to go along with this. Absolute, and I think a lot of this was orchestrated by Teddy Roosevelt, who just pushing him into that war direction.
Yeah, certainly
anyway,
Hearst and Pulitzer as well. And yeah, I mean, the problem was that there was a large American appetite for liberating Cuba, which eventually McKinley felt powerless to oppose. Yes. But you see, before war was declared, you see McKinley and Mark Hanna, who was his campaign manager, as two of the leading opponents of trying to push for a peaceful resolution the entire time. So the idea that he's this fanatical imperialist.
Yeah. The funny part about Cuba is that in the beginning, I mean, people knew very little about Cuba, okay? And they had this idea that the pure oppressed Cubans, they were all kind of white men, okay?
Exactly.
And then once they got there and they discovered, oh no, Cubans are not white. Then all of a sudden the tone in the media changed about the Cubans. And Teddy Roosevelt himself, okay, had some very disgusting things to say about the Cuban people. Anyway,
well, that's very interesting. I'm looking forward to you exploring that more. That sounds really interesting. And just one thing before I go, because Marty said something about Henry Cabot Lodge being central to the assassination by Kropotkin and Emma Goldman. If you have any books or anything you could recommend on that, I'd be highly interested. That's something that I'm looking into, is the Emma Goldman connection.
Did you want to say something to that, Martin?
Oh, hold on. Sure. Hang on. There. I think I'm on sound again. Very happy to, Sam. Email me and let's swap stuff on this. I think Matt may even have printed something by me on this in Canadian Patriot Review, and I published it in Strategic Culture Foundation, which you cannot even access online anymore under the Magnitsky Act in the United States. It was totally shut down. Yeah, I was personally visited by the FBI, not because of anything I wrote in Strategic Culture Review, but just because I was writing for Strategic Culture Review. There's the First Amendment for you under Joe Biden, right? But you're absolutely right, and there is a very close causal connection, and it's hugely important because they actually follow the same operational model that they used, that Kropotkin and the British used to assassinate Tsar Alexander II in St. Petersburg in 1881. It's followed to a T in Buffalo in 1901 in the assassination of McKinley. Buffalo, remember, is a small, dirty, industrial city. It's a very strange place to hold a world fair. And that's the first point. And yet they have one there. And the real reason is to lure President McKinley from Washington, where it's much harder to get at him. And Buffalo had the most violent and best organized anarchist underground organization in the United States at the time. And it didn't have a large, sophisticated police force. In Chicago, in New York, even in LA, the police took the anarchist threat seriously and at a local police level. Notice this is not at a federal level, it's at a local level. They kept tabs on these people, and in Boston too. So it was much harder for them to operate violently with impunity in these places. In Chicago, especially after the Haymarket bombings in the 1880s, this was the case. But Buffalo is ideal for them. Yet we find Count Peter Kropotkin lives in London, right? Visits, of all places, Buffalo twice in 2 years before the assassination of President McKinley. And deals closely with people there. And he's a lover of Emma Goldman, who worshipped him all his life and even attended his funeral in Moscow in the 1920s. And Goldman's relationship with Leon Czolgosz, the murderer of President McKinley, was personal and direct. And she is exposed of this in the American press, not in the Hearst media, of course, but in other aspects of the American media at the time. And the outrage of, ultimately forces her to become much more neutral. And eventually she's forced out of the country to Canada. And Kropotkin is banned from coming to the United States anymore, where he has traveled with impunity. But when he came to the United States on the key visit where he appears to have organized and orchestrated the future assassination of President McKinley, where does he stay? He stays in the Colonial Club at Harvard, in Cambridge to be precise, outside Boston. And who is a key figure organizing the Colonial Club and deciding who stays there and who gets its hospitality or not? Why, Henry Cabot Lodge, of course. So there is actually a great, and I didn't have to do any digging on this. I didn't have to actually go places, interview people, research primary documentation. The documentation on this is easily available online. And in 125 years, nobody except you folks and me following you has looked at this. Nobody. So you're absolutely right, Sam. You're on a mother lode here.
Well, Marty, yeah, you just kind of blew my mind a little bit with some of those.
You do that to me all the time, so I owe you that, man. You know?
I was also.
I will definitely email you.
Please do. Yes.
I was also wondering if the location of Buffalo had anything to do with the nearness of the Canadian border.
I hadn't thought of that aspect. You must be right. Absolutely. Absolutely. But it is also notorious for, as I say, the most violent anarchist cell in the United States. And Macht, Joachim Macht, who leads that cell, is so extreme that he's even been an embarrassment in the past to Goldman and her associates. But they happily swallow their pride there. And Goldman's personal meeting with Leon Czolgosz is actually publicly documented, and she's forced to acknowledge it. And she's interviewed about it, and she claims that she was tortured and lied about, and the left to this day reveres Goldman idiotically and blindly. She's become a feminist icon. So she's burn-proof in American academia. The very fact that we say this gives them yet another excuse to turn up their arrogant noses at all of us, being all the ignorant peasants that we all are. So you cannot break through these levels of ignorance and prejudice. But the actual factual evidence is not imaginary. It's public domain, and it's hard, and it's there.
Fantastic info. Thank you, Marty, and thank you, Magda. I'll leave it to the next question now. And Marty, I'll email you soon.
Absolutely,
Thanks,
man.
Yes, this is all fascinating. And in 2 weeks, when you go to part 2, Magdalena, we'll continue this discussion with Sam and Marty. This is good. Okay, we have a few other quick questions here. Richard, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, Magdalena, thank you. And thank you, everyone. This is so informative and educational here. Just a little question. I was wondering, in this decision to pursue imperialism, what kind of role was played or not played by like Rockefeller and Carnegie and the big industrialists? I mean, I would assume they would be behind it for market reasons, but I don't know. Just curious.
I'm not specifically, I haven't come across that in James Bradley's book, okay, too much. Of course, the expansion is also economically important, especially going towards the west across the Pacific Ocean, I would think, okay. I know that with later on with Hawaii and so forth, this was very much involving the sugar interests in New York. So, as I said, I didn't come across it too much in Bradley's book on this.
Maybe Martin
Maybe
has.
Martin, you know any more? Martin?
I'm basically the same as you, Magdalena. My sense of it is, again, that people here like Sam, Richard, Jerry, most of you would probably know a lot more on this than me. This is a case where the mad romantic imperialism of Teddy Roosevelt and the Pacific visionaries was actually bad business. There was huge American business in China cooperating with the Brits in the opium trade. And this is actually where even the great President Franklin Roosevelt's grandfather, his Delano grandfather, made his money in the opium trade with China. President Roosevelt not only knew about this, but openly talked about it. And actually, his policies towards China were genuinely high-minded and idealistic. They were also very naive because Chiang Kai-shek was a fascist, a prototypic type Nazi, and a dictator. And FDR was quite naive on those aspects of Chinese politics. American ignorance of what was actually happening in China was enormous. But as far as the Rockefellers and their people go, Wall Street was obsessed with Mexico, where there was oil, and I've spoken on this before too. Effectively, once Diaz took power in 1876, and the great democratically elected leaders of Mexico had been eliminated in the 1870s once Ulysses S. Grant was no longer able to protect them, which he had done very effectively and seriously, as Lincoln had before him. After that, Mexico really gets enslaved by the British and the French. And it's a dark era, a Stalinist and a Nazi era in Mexico, when literally 1 million Mexican people are violently slaughtered, and the average life expectancy of people in Mexico drops by 20 years during those 35 years. And this is not during the Mexican Civil War. This is under the era when liberal enlightenment is supposed. It's just like we've seen in the last 40 and 50 years. Whenever we smash a country and we go in, we bring in color revolutions. Arguably, the first of these was in Mexico in 1876, when we destroy the genuine democracy and install this monstrous military dictatorship under Diaz for 35 years. And the people are slaughtered and they die of starvation. And this is very well documented, but it doesn't get into the media at the time. It doesn't get into the media at all at the time. But American big business is central in this. And New York money is huge in Mexico. By the beginning, under TR, it really starts penetrating significantly south into Argentina, Brazil, most of all Venezuela, because the oil is in Venezuela, and oil is becoming important in the first decade of the 20th century. Hasn't been before, but becomes it then. And Standard Oil, of course, is also eagerly looking as far afield as the Middle East through Turkey in the first decade of the 20th century and before that, because there's already oil in the Russian Empire in Baku, but the British and the Dutch through Royal Dutch Shell have got that sewn up, and they're big enough to keep the Americans out. But therefore, American big business is obsessed with Mexico and enslaving Mexico, and it's looking at Europe and the Middle East. It's going worldwide already. But they actually, again, there are parallels with some of the madder neocon adventures here, both, Israeli empire in Syria. Well, they use the excuse of having oil in Syria, and there's rare earths in Ukraine, but they're in parts of Ukraine which Russia already controls and will never give up. But these are used to get us more deeply involved in Ukraine and in Syria. But there is really no serious American business rational interest in Ukraine or Syria. There isn't. And but we get sucked into it anyway. And that's really the answer to your comment, Magdalena, or at least my contribution to it. Hawaii is central. They're determined to take the Philippines because they're dreaming of a Pacific-wide empire. But they're dreaming of empire and power and glory. They're not. This is the opposite of trade following the flag. The flag is going out first, and trade will be drummed up afterwards to justify it. And of course, my argument in the future is going to be that trade never worked for America in East Asia. You had fat cats like Delano and the other opium kings who made huge personal fortunes in China. But the American economy and the American people never benefited from this. And giving Japan a free hand to enslave Korea in return for them giving us a free hand to enslave the Philippines was bad business.
Yeah.
And the Philippines was bad business. We never made a profit from the Philippines. Yeah. We carried out war crimes and exterminations in the Philippines,
yeah.
as you well know.
Yeah.
I think better than me. But there was never, it was never good business. The one other point, I mean, rein me in, otherwise I'll get out of control as usual. But Teddy Roosevelt is another of his closest personal friends, not just a correspondent, but they were soulmates together, was the British imperialist poet Rudyard Kipling. Mm-hmm. And they always met in the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. Later on, incidentally, it was also the favorite haunt of Edward Teller, a very father of the hydrogen bomb, and a very one of the great fathers of the Cold War, and a truly evil and sinister SOB. I often had to go to the Cosmos Club to cover meetings there. And their breakfasts in particular were very pleasant, but I always felt unclean and needing to have an immediate afternoon shower when I got home after I went to the Cosmos Club. I never felt that way at the other great Washington clubs, but the Cosmos Club is the haunt of neocons for the past 40 or 50 years, and it was where Rudyard Kipling and Theodore Roosevelt used to meet to spin their fantasies of world domination back in the 1890s. And when Roosevelt died, Kipling wrote a very mawkish poem about him called Greatheart. And, what light is there left in the world now that Greatheart is dead? Whimper, sob, blubber, or, round up the usual suspects, right? But, sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay, so there are two things that just, when you were talking, that came to my mind.
Sure.
Okay, one of the things is, this was the importance about Fred Turner's Frontiers thesis, right? Because the United States was expanding westwards to the coast to the California coast, and in that time frame, so a lot of the emphasis in commerce and so forth was directed towards going west, okay, and developing and creating economies westwards. And then once Turner said, well, now we reach the coast, we need to expand further, we have to create a new frontier, right? We have to have a new frontier. Our old frontier, our country is now filled, in other words. That's my take on it, okay? We gotta find a new frontier, and now it's westwards towards the Pacific, okay? To those islands, to Philippines and so forth, okay? That's the next jump, right? Of the Anglo-Saxons. So that's one thing I want to also say. Secondly, what was the other thing? Oh my God. Okay. It comes back to me. Sorry. I'm getting old with my age too. Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, I think we have time
yeah.
for a couple more questions. Let's see. Kevin has been waiting for quite a while. Kevin, if you want to ask your question, and after Kevin, Manaka, did I pronounce that correctly? She has a question, Magdalena. So Kevin first and Manaka.
Thank you. My question is about the roots, let's say, about their belief system, about the Anglo-Saxons. You mentioned definitely that a couple times they mentioned God. So I'm just wondering, do they believe that they're created by God to do what they're doing? Is it more evolutionary, like the measuring of the skulls? That's more like Darwinian, or that they have evolved superior to these other races. So in all of your research, Magdalena, an excellent presentation. What is the, let's say, root cause of their thinking? Or they don't even look into that. They just, they're just possessed by conquering.
Well, but that's part of it, right? The thing is, if you believe God created you, okay, and you have a superior skull, okay, a bigger skull which can hold more mustard seeds than anybody else, that is your proof that God meant you to rule the world, right?
Okay.
Okay, so that's and that's also, yeah, I mean, it's very convoluted and obviously crazy, but for our thinking now, it's crazy. For them, it was the philosophy, the accepted philosophy that God made you with a bigger skull, showing therefore his thinking that you should be ruling the world because you have better reasoning skills because of your bigger skull.
Okay.
So this is the kind of, okay, and okay, I'm not in philosophy. That you should talk to my nephew about that. He's very good at it. Okay, but anyway, so that was the underlying belief of justification for all this nonsense.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, the mustard philosophy of the world contest. Exactly, Martin. Mustard seeds. Okay. I will never look at mustard seeds the same way again.
Why mustard seed? I don't know, but okay, we
Well,
have
because they're small, right?
okay. We have a comment or question from Manaka. Please go ahead.
Oh, you're on
Hi.
mute, Manaka.
Hi, yeah,
Hi.
it's it's Menaha. Sorry for my delivery. It's just that you can't see it, but at my end, everything's flashing. It's at my end. It's no one's others' problem. But just a couple of things. Actually, the last point that I think it was Richard. Did you raise about? Oh yes, and you came back with a response. Also on that is like, yes, that there were these beliefs and people genuinely believed them, and I guess also there's a question about who was creating those narratives in the first place and spreading those. Does that make sense?
Are you asking me who started the
Yes.
narrative? Well,
No, but I'm just sort of speaking to that like I agree with what you're saying, that, or that's one way of looking at it, about how it came about that people believed that and acted on that. But I'm wondering as well, and it's not an original idea, that a lot of these narratives and so-called theories were like another group of people who were spreading those kind of beliefs and false narratives and encouraging people like Roosevelt or whoever we're talking about to imbibe them.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's that's
all.
As I showed in my presentation, you had all these university professors. I mean, who went to university back then? It was the elite. It wasn't widespread that people would go to university, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the elite sent their kids to these universities where they ran into people like this, okay, Morton and so forth, Brooks Adams and so forth. And And
I
of
guess what I'm
course,
saying is that so are you saying that elites were privy to all that ideology and the falseness of it?
yeah, well, it started there, right? But also with
Yes.
everything else, with education, and also the education system was not as, I should say, not as widespread, okay,
Sure.
yet. However, I think there was a deeper understanding of things, more study of things, okay, than nowadays. I think we are very much more superficial nowadays in education than
Yeah,
at
I'm
least
not
at the
disagreeing or
lower level.
challenging. I'm not
Yeah.
disagreeing or challenging
No,
anything you
no. It's
said.
okay. It's okay.
I'm just,
I'm
and
trying to
another
figure out.
point. Sorry. Yes, go on.
Of course, the issue is and how these things spread, right?
Mm,
Absolutely. But it is through the university, as I think very clearly showed. But then, of course, also through the media,
yes.
through the
Yeah,
newspapers.
yeah.
Newspapers were there was no television, there was no radio, right? There was no cell phones, okay, where you can go on the internet and so forth, okay? Newspapers were a major way to get one's view across, and people read these newspapers very widely. And as I said, a number of these professors, their speeches were printed verbatim in the newspapers,
Yeah.
causing the kind of discussion within the population to spread around this stuff, right? So
Yes.
that's one thing. Also, the other thing I wanted to it just came to my mind again in response to the earlier thing. I would very much recommend for people to look at the political cartoons of Puck magazine and Judge magazine, okay, around this time, around the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, and see these political cartoons, because obviously they were also meant for some of them were satirical and some of them were, propaganda pieces, okay, for the population. And I would probably say that the cartoons were more there for the, okay, less educated, maybe. I don't know if I can say that, okay? But pictures often are replacing the written word.
Oh, and I just want to say,
Especially-
Magdalena, I really enjoyed your talk today.
Thank you.
And
Thank
I'd
you,
like to
Renata.
also that there's space for us to discuss it, and then you do the second part. I mean, I haven't been to many of these. I've only attended a couple, but I like the format that you're offering, that, we can chat in a lot of detail, because I found some of the contributions today great to listen to and really stimulating. And finally on that, Martin, I just want to say one thing. I thought, it was fascinating what you brought today, but you mentioned about Ukraine, and like there's not much. I think I'm not that well versed on it, but you said that you felt there wasn't necessarily, that it was some ways, ironic or perplexing, because there's not a lot of opportunity for necessarily business there. Is that correct?
Well, no,
What I
no,
wanted
not quite.
to say,
No, I didn't make myself clear, Manha. Yeah, and your point is right. There is an enormous amount of Western business that's gone into Ukraine, and Ukraine is being neo-colonized now. It has been by America for the past 10, 12 years. And this latest bizarre 100-year treaty that the British, of all people, have concluded with Ukraine would actually enslave Ukraine according to exactly the same terms under which they enslaved India in the 18th century. And China in the 19th century, when they took control of, they didn't try to directly take control of government. They just controlled it through bribery, assassination, corruption, and all the usual methods. But they took direct control of the ports, the customs, the railroads and communications. And this treaty has a secret annex, which the Ukrainians have already leaked, which has this in it. Now, it's never going to be fulfilled. But because the Russians won't let it, the Europeans and the Chinese won't let it, it really is a mad pipe, and the Americans wouldn't let it. But it shows you what the City of London is still desperately dreaming to do to the state. So I'm sorry, you are correct. There is a lot of industry.
No, actually, I wasn't going to say that. I was going to say I wasn't challenging anything you said because I'm not well
no
versed.
problem.
But I was thinking more that isn't it also about the resources for the AI? Is that not an element as well?
I don't think it's a direct element there, but in terms of raw materials which are necessary, if rare earths, I'm sure are necessary. If I think this too, you're way ahead of me on this. But the rare earths are necessary for AI. They're also necessary for cell phones and for the communications we're doing now. And the Americans actually have quite a lot in their own territory. They just haven't been developing it, and they haven't put selfishly any money into investing in building refineries for it, the way the Chinese and the Russians and the Indians much more sensibly have been doing. So that's why they're so desperate for shortcuts to still get the stuff now. So AI is involved in this, but as far as Ukraine and Syria goes, more indirectly. But I think, as Jean-Sebastian and others have said, you have this mad drive for empire, which Magdalena has so frighteningly and vividly documented for us, and it's irrational. But then there's greed as well. And sometimes they conflict with each other. But what very often happens is the drive for power and empire comes first. And then afterwards, they diversify. In India, it was the opposite. The British went in, as you know, just to basically drain the country dry. And they did. And empire somewhat reluctantly followed it. Afterwards, the East India Company, as you know, provokes the first national rebellion in the 1850s. And then the British attitude is we have to clamp down on India much more thoroughly and systematically to prevent a nightmare like that ever happening again. What they, as you know, what they called the First War of National Liberation in India in 1857, for the British, they call it the Indian Mutiny. From their perspective, the Indians had no right to rise up to fight for their own freedom and their own prosperity and their own survival. How outrageous that they should be rising up against us. And we see the same attitudes against neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism around the world today. And it's very ironic. I should be saying this in full agreement with you and other folks here, because most of my life, I was an old-fashioned Anglo-American conservative. I came to Washington as a sincere Reaganite. In British terms, I was a Thatcherite and proud of it. And in terms of what Thatcher especially achieved in Britain, with great difficulty, I still admire her in very many respects. But it was only very slowly, from my vantage point in Washington, I came to see how right people like you and Jerry and Magdalena and Matt and Sam and Cynthia are. It took me a lot. I kept thinking, well, Western free trade is a good idea, but we're going a bit too far. If only we can rein in a little bit here and stop bombing the Libyans there and stop bombing the Syrians there, then everything will be fine. I never realized it's all a hydra. It's all part of the same compulsive drive. And of course, it goes hundreds of years back, not as a conspiracy, but as an empire, as economic interests, as an integrated octopus with all these arms, but well, actually, I was going to say with the same brain, and that's where the analogy breaks down. Because, well, maybe it doesn't, because an octopus is a central brain, but all its tentacles have their own brains, just as the America has its lots of different brains. I'm sorry, I'm going on too much here.
Maybe ideology is ideology maybe a good word?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you. Exactly. It's ideology, and it's mixed in with greed and self-interest and the limited liability company. The East India Company was the very first of these, and it was so successful and profitable. The British, clearly, Jean-Sébastien, maybe you want to come in here. You clearly know a lot more about this than I do. Again, I didn't come into this systematically. I was forced to back into this when I started looking at what I thought were excesses of a more rational and balanced system. And then I discovered they weren't excesses at all. They were the natural expression of something horrific and out of control that had been going on for hundreds of years.
Thank you for sharing that. That was fascinating. And I'll go now. I'll be quiet now. I've taken a lot of space. But I just want to say I'll definitely be coming back to some of these meetings. I thought it was great today. And I really enjoyed what you brought, Magdalena. I'm looking forward to the second part. But I really enjoyed what everyone else shared. So thank you.
Thank you, my dear.
Okay, and we're getting near to when we're going to wrap up, but I think, Richard, if you're still there, you had one last follow-up you wanted to ask. So I'll let Richard ask that, and then I think that'll be it for today's class.
Well, thank you very much. I want to get back to this pursuit of frontier. And I wonder, would it be fair to say that the American overall economic paradigm for the very beginning was based on the shoveling in of new land and new resources? So in some sense, it's always been an unstable economic system that always needed new inputs to keep prospering. And you can almost see that with Trump now. I wonder, do you see any validity in that?
Well, to a certain degree, but see, this approach is also leaving one very, very, very important component out, which is human innovation. Okay, and I think that's the most important. So you can have a limited area of space, okay, and as a people, if you don't innovate and you come up with new things, okay, then you're stuck. Then you're bound to you have to expand westwards. You have to expand outside of your boundaries, right? However,
Yes.
with new innovations, you actually don't so much need to do that.
Exactly, but I wasn't saying that it is in fact necessary to keep expanding. We thought it was like a paradigm built into our psychology that we always need to be expanding in order to prosper. You know, it's like a...
Well, yeah, I mean, that's human nature. It's all, we're also we're hopefully we're always curious, right? I agree. Okay, I would always like to see what's on the other side of that fence. What's happening there? Sure, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Magdalena, for that stimulating, that thought-provoking presentation. And I'd like to thank everybody who came today, even if they came a little bit late, but you still came. We like that, Jean-Sébastien. And please join us next week. I'm not sure who will be presenting next week, but in 2 weeks, tentatively, it's scheduled for Magdalena to do her part 2 of this class. So I hope everyone will definitely be there for that. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, everybody.